The lights go out in a place you will never see. Not in Silicon Valley, not on Wall Street, not in some glitzy launch party streamed in 4K. A hillside somewhere far away. A field command post, a cluster of laptops on folding tables under a camouflage net. Men and women in uniforms staring at screens that just went black. Maps vanish, drones freeze, encrypted chat windows die mid-sentence. For a few long seconds, nothing happens. Then the shouting starts. It isn't an enemy jamming signal. It isn't a solar flare. It isn't even the local government ordering a shutdown. It's a configuration change in a private satellite network owned by a man who is, at that exact moment, thousands of kilometers away, scrolling his phone, maybe half watching a movie, maybe composing a meme. Someone in that darkened tent picks up a secure phone and calls a contact who sends a message that ends, eventually, not at a Ministry of Defense, not at NATO headquarters, not at the United Nations, but in the inbox of a billionaire. And the question in that moment is not, can we persuade a democratic institution to authorize this? It's, will he say yes? How many times in your life have you been told that decisions about war and peace, infrastructure and communication, life and death are made by institutions, checks, balances, laws? And how often have you stopped to ask whether, somewhere behind all of that, there are still moments that come down to one person's mood? Now look down at your own hands. Maybe you're holding a phone that routes your messages through satellites his company launched. Maybe the car in your driveway runs on software his team pushes updates to overnight. Maybe the news you read and the arguments that shape your opinions are filtered through an app he bought on a whim, then set on fire in public just to see what would happen. How many parts of your day would notice if he decided, abruptly, to change direction? Not the man on the magazine covers, not the meme, not the superhero or supervillain your side loves or hates. The human being, the one who tweets at 3 a.m, the one who jokes and taunts and picks fights, the one whose impulses now sit frighteningly close to the plumbing of your world. How did we get here? How did a single person born in a small corner of the world end up with fingertips resting on rockets, cars, power grids, satellites, brain interfaces, and the flow of information itself? Is he an evil genius with a master plan? A chaotic gambler who keeps accidentally winning big enough to stay in the game? A necessary monster created by governments too slow and companies too timid? Or is he something worse? A mirror, showing us what happens when a civilization quietly decides that it would rather outsource risk, imagination, and infrastructure to one hyper-functional obsessive than pretend it still runs the show? Rewind. Before there were rockets and electric cars and fanboys inventing new adjectives for disruptive, there was a skinny kid clicking through early internet forums, devouring science fiction and staring at numbers in bank accounts that never seemed big enough. He wasn't the only ambitious immigrant in North America. He wasn't the only one who thought the future was moving too slowly. What set him apart wasn't just intelligence. The world is littered with smart people. It was an allergy to boredom and an almost pathological discomfort with the idea of limits. PayPal was the first proof. Most people look at an online payments company and see an online payments company, a better way to move money around, a business model. He saw something different. Leverage, control the pipes, and you don't just skim fees. You sit in the middle of the flow, quietly powerful, watching every transaction pass by. Too useful to kill, too embedded to ignore. The exit made him rich, not old money rich, not vacation homes and a yacht rich. A new kind of rich, enough capital to stop listening to other people's ideas about what was realistic. Most people, after cashing out like that, diversify. They buy safe things, they join boards, they give polite TED Talks about learning to give back. He did something much stranger. He took nearly everything he'd won and shoved it into 2 bets that, at the time, looked clinically insane. One, that he could will an electric car company into existence in an industry famous for devouring startups, 2, that he could build rockets cheaper and better than nations that had been doing it for half a century. Ask yourself, what kind of person looks at a fortune that could set them up for 20 lifetimes and says, not enough risk, spin the wheel again? Is that courage? Ego? Addiction? All of the above? In those early years, there were no star-struck documentaries breathlessly narrating his master plan. There were engineers sleeping under desks, rockets blowing up over the ocean, cars delayed and mocked, investors doubting, journalists lining up to write obituaries. He came close to losing everything, more than once. And here's the hinge that's easy to miss if you only know the story in hindsight. If those rockets had kept exploding for just a little longer, if those cars had kept missing their deadlines, today he would be a cautionary tale about hubris, not a candidate for new emperor of the modern world. His story isn't straight genius. It's genius plus a disgusting tolerance for near-total failure. Everyone likes to repeat the line about sleeping on factory floors, about betting the last dollars on one final launch. It's become part of the legend, the way all empires retrospectively invent their own omens. But under the romance, there's a quieter question. What does it do to a person when they learn over and over again that recklessness, if you're just smart and lucky enough, gets rewarded? If you discovered in your 30s that you could repeatedly gamble with thousands of people's jobs and billions of dollars and walk away richer and more famous each time, what would that do to your sense of limits? To the rest of us, Tesla and SpaceX looked like two separate miracles. To him, they began to look like pieces. The same factories that learned how to push battery technology for cars could push it for grid storage and rockets. The same obsession with weight and efficiency that made spacecraft cheaper could make electric vehicles faster and more desirable. The same story. We are saving humanity from itself, could justify both. Do you feel how intoxicating that is? Not just to him, to governments. Because while investors were calling him reckless, the same states that once monopolized space looked over and saw something very simple, a man willing to spend his own money to solve problems they had left to rot. Cheaper access to orbit, ambitious electric transport, potential new energy infrastructure. You are a politician staring at climate deadlines, budget shortfalls, and voters demanding miracles. In that situation, what is he to you? A threat or a gift? The truth is ugly in its simplicity. He took on the most expensive, slowest, most bureaucratic problems on the planet. And the people who should have been doing that work, states, agencies, conglomerates, were so relieved anyone, was moving that fast that they let him dig his fingers deep into their systems. Launch contracts, tax credits, regulatory carve-outs, public-private partnerships, letters of intent, quiet phone calls. The flags painted on the rockets were national. The logos on the cars were corporate. But thread by thread, decision by decision, a different pattern was emerging behind all the noise. When you needed something bold done in space, you called him. When you wanted to show you were serious about decarbonizing transport, you subsidized him. When you were an engineer who hated bureaucracy and wanted to work on the future, you sent your CV to him. Did he write a secret blueprint in some leather-bound notebook that said, Step 1, online payments, Step 2, cars, Step 3, rockets, Step 4, empire? Or did the empire start to form the moment he realized that the fastest way to become unavoidable was to stop building products and start building the roads, skies, and wires other people's products depend on? If you control how people move, how data moves, how energy moves, you don't need a crown. You just need everyone else to slowly forget what the world looked like before you got there. Right now, somewhere over your head, a mesh of satellites is passing by that didn't exist 15 years ago. Right now, somewhere in a factory, robots his teams designed are cutting metal that will become the skeletons of vehicles and storage systems that will outlive their first owners. Right now, somewhere in a meeting, a government official is having to ask themselves not just, is this good policy, but how will he react? You don't have to like him. You don't have to believe he's a genius. You don't even have to think his companies will survive the next crash. But if you're honest, you have to admit at least this. We let one man make himself indispensable to the way the modern world moves. The only real question is whether that happened because he outsmarted everyone, or because the people who were supposed to guard the levers of power were too tired, too captured, or too scared to touch them themselves. If this were just a story about a reckless rich man and his toys, it would end there. But look at what those toys actually became. Begin on the ground with something small and innocent-looking, a car. It's quiet when it moves. No roaring engine, no gears clunking. Just a low hum, a screen, an app. You tap your phone and the doors unlock. You sit down and the car already knows who you are, what music you like, where you usually drive at this time of day. You think you bought a vehicle. You actually bought a rolling computer that talks constantly to a server farm you will never see. Every time you drive, it learns. Every turn you make, every hesitation, every near miss. It sends those whispers back home, where they're fed into models, into code, into decisions. Not just decisions about your car, decisions about everyone's. At first, the bargain feels perfect. You give up a little privacy, a little control over when and how your car updates. And in return, you get a machine that gets smarter, safer, more efficient over time. Overnight, while you sleep, someone else pushes new software into a thing that weighs a couple of tons and lives in your garage. It wakes up with new behaviors. It might break differently. It might accelerate differently. One day, it might stop needing you at all. Most of us accepted that trade with barely a shrug. We were tired of gas prices, tired of maintenance, tired of the sense that nothing in our lives was improving except our screens. Here, at last, was a piece of the future you could actually sit in. So we signed. We told ourselves we were just buying a car, just like our parents did. What we were really doing was volunteering our streets, our commutes, our driving habits as training data for something bigger. An attempt to make this man's company the operating system for terrestrial movement. Zoom out. The same obsession with efficiency and control that turned electric cars into data-gathering devices also turned rockets into something else: infrastructure. For decades, space launches were rare, ceremonial events. Flags, hushed commentators, months of build-up for a single ascent. Now, thanks in large part to his gamble, they're closer to a bus schedule, a launch every few days, sometimes more. Reusable boosters dropping back to Earth like something out of a film, dust plumes billowing, landing legs unfolding with balletic precision. Pretty, yes. More importantly, cheap. Cheaper launches mean you can throw a lot more metal into the sky, not just big, expensive satellites for governments and telecoms, swarms of small ones, thousands, tens of thousands. Imagine a spiderweb being spun around the planet, strand by strand, each one a node in a privately owned network. Starlink was sold as a way to get internet to people forgotten by the existing infrastructure: remote villages, ships, disaster zones, rural homes ignored by the big ISPs. Some of that is true. Entire communities now exist online because of that mesh. But the same network can, with a few changes in settings no one voted on, become something else. A military asset, a geopolitical bargaining chip, a quiet reminder to states that their armies no longer march entirely on their own logistics. Somewhere between those rockets and those cars sits a third realm: information. Once upon a time, social media was the side hustle in his story. A noisy, chaotic town square he didn't build but decided to buy, on a dare to himself and the world. If you're honest, you probably laughed when he did it, or cheered, or rolled your eyes. It felt like a stunt, a distraction, another rich man playing with a shiny thing. And yet, your news, your arguments, the narratives that reach you first before they're filtered by television or newspapers now pass through a platform he owns and rewires in public, Sometimes by polling the crowd, sometimes by waking up in a mood and pressing tweet. It isn't that he personally moderates every post. Of course not. No one human can steer that river. But he decides who gets fired, who gets hired, which safety systems get stripped, which accounts get restored, which policies get laughed out of the room. That's not control over all speech. It is something more subtle and, in some ways, more dangerous. Influence over the conditions in which millions of people decide what they believe. Cars, rockets, satellites, feeds. And somewhere off to the side, experimental projects that sound almost like parody until you remember who's paying for them. Neural implants that promise to connect brains to machines. Robotics projects that turn factory arms into humanoid workers. AI models promised as open 1 minute and strategic assets the next. You don't have to understand the technical details to grasp the pattern. He has put himself, deliberately, at the intersections where physical movement, digital movement, energy, and information all cross. If a government did that, we would call it an infrastructure state. When a man does it, we call it innovation. You didn't sit down one day and say, I consent to living under a private infrastructure regime. You said yes to a cheaper launch contract here, a tax credit there, a subsidy for EVs, a satellite service in a rural town, a platform that told you it was fighting the censorship you hated, a futuristic story about saving humanity from extinction. Tiny yes after tiny yes, from millions of people and dozens of governments, layered over 20 years. That's how empires are built now, not with battleships, with billing cycles. It would be comforting in a way if this were the work of a master chess player bent over a huge board, calmly moving pieces according to some flawless plan. Comforting, because you could tell yourself that if you just exposed the plan, the spell would break. The truth is messier. His companies bleed into each other not because of some mystical Musk loop, but because that's what happens when you stuff one brain, one set of obsessions, one group of loyal lieutenants into multiple domains and tell them to solve everything the same way. Move fast, take insane risks, ignore everyone who tells you no, and clean up later. Talent flows between them. Engineers who cut their teeth on rockets show up designing robots. Battery experts jump from cars to grid storage to satellites. Many leave burnt out, but enough stay. Government money flows between them too, indirectly. Launch contracts and exploration deals stabilize the rocket company, making banks and investors more forgiving when another rocket fails. Carbon credits and subsidies hold up the car business when margins are thin. Those valuations become lines of credit, collateral, fuel for the next acquisition, the next bet. When the social media platform flails, where does the rescue money come from? Selling stock in the car company. Using the reputation built on rockets and EVs to reassure lenders, this chaos is just temporary genius at work, not mismanagement. You might admire that. The sheer audacity of juggling that many flaming torches without burning the house down is genuinely impressive. But you also have to ask, what happens if he slips? What happens to your pension fund, your state's investment board, your job at a supplier when one domino falls and knocks over the others? Because this empire, if that's what it is, isn't built like Rome. It isn't stone and legions marching. It's capital and confidence. Every project is leveraged on the belief that he will land the next rocket, hit the next production goal, secure the next subsidy, tweet the next market-moving line. Confidence is powerful. It's also fragile. In private, regulators and officials know this. They know how much they now depend on him and men like him. They know that too harsh a move could crash markets and careers. They know too soft a move will make them look captured. So they dance. They fine him, but not too much. They scold him in public hearings, then sign new contracts. They announce investigations that move slowly enough not to scare the horses. This is the quietest trade of all. We give you contracts, praise, and room to run, and in return, you give us plausible deniability. When people ask why the future is in your hands, we point to your genius and your risk-taking, instead of admitting we outsourced our responsibilities. Employees make their own trade. We give you our 20s, our 30s, our marriages, our sleep, and you give us a shot at changing the world and a stock grant that might one day let us walk away. Investors make theirs. We give you obscene valuations on the promise that you are not a CEO, you are a narrative. And you keep feeding that narrative with bigger rockets, bigger promises, bigger enemies. You, sitting here, make yours as well, whether you admit it or not. You give me a story where anyone is actually doing something about the future. And I will forgive a level of chaos and ego I would never tolerate in anyone who didn't make cool things. None of those deals look evil on their face. That's why they work. The danger isn't that we've been hypnotized by a comic book villain. It's that a critical mass of our institutions, our markets, and our own private hopes decided that living inside one man's overlapping experiments felt less frightening than facing a future with nobody willing to touch the hard problems at all. So here we are. Cars that drive themselves, on roads that weren't built for them, rockets that launch other people's armies' eyes and ears, satellites that can blink a war zone online or offline, a town square that can be rewired mid-argument, a man at the center of all of it, oscillating between visionary troll, supplicant to regulators, and self-styled king of the nerds. Is that an empire? Or is it a pile of risky, half-stable bridges built over voids the rest of us were too scared to look into? Whichever answer you lean toward, you're not watching this from a safe distance. You're standing on one of those bridges. Bridges always look strongest the day before they fail. You can stand on one, feel the concrete under your feet, listen to the reassuring hum of traffic, and have no idea that somewhere inside the structure, tiny fractures are already spidering out, hunting for each other. From the outside, Elon Musk's network of companies still looks like one of the most impressive structures ever thrown over the abyss between what is and what might be. From the inside, the cracks are hard to ignore. Start with the one that everyone can see but few really look at: the man himself. The myth is simple. Depending on your tribe, he's either Iron Man or Lex Luthor, genius savior or dangerous narcissist. Both versions are lazy. The real problem isn't that he's uniquely monstrous. It's that he's ordinary in all the ways a person with that much power is never supposed to be. Petty, thin-skinned, addicted to attention, thrilled by risk until it gets boring, then hunting for a bigger hit. You see it online in bursts, midnight posts that tank billions in market value, jokes that aren't jokes, polls that decide policies, insults flung at regulators, critics, employees, entire countries. If any mid-level manager behaved like that publicly, they'd be fired before lunch. When he does it, we call it unfiltered, or iconoclastic, or just how geniuses are. Do you feel the quiet double standard there? The very systems that talk endlessly about accountability and governance have made an exception for a man who sits closer to critical infrastructure than almost any unelected individual in modern history. Regulators huff and puff. They issue warnings, they open investigations, they fine his companies for safety lapses, for disclosure failures, for environmental impact. But watch what happens after the press conferences. The rockets keep flying, the contracts keep renewing, the factories keep expanding. Because buried underneath the public scolding is a fear no one ever says out loud: what happens to us if we actually pull the plug? If you ban his launches, dozens of missions stall. If you choke his subsidies, thousands of jobs vanish. If you shatter his companies, you risk a market panic that eats ordinary people's pensions long before it touches his last island of cash. Empire in the old days meant soldiers on your streets. Empire now means realizing that the man you're trying to discipline is also the one you quietly outsourced half your ambitions to. It's easier in those circumstances to turn him into a morality play. We zoom in on his messy relationships, his insults, his political flirtations. We argue over whether he's gone too far, or red-pilled, or sold out, or finally telling the truth. It feels satisfying. picking over his character. It also serves as a distraction from the system that made him necessary. Because even if you removed him from the picture tomorrow, the incentives that produced him would still be there. Governments too risk-averse to experiment in public. Markets desperate for a single stock, a single story to believe in. Citizens so starved of visible progress that they will forgive almost anything in anyone who makes the future feel real again. You can see this tension most clearly in the places where his projects collide directly with flesh and bone. A pedestrian killed by a car whose driver trusted the marketing more than the fine print. A family whose loved one signs up for an experimental brain implant because the pitch makes it sound like a ticket out of hell. A country whose battlefield communications depend suddenly on the whims of a private company headquartered thousands of kilometers away. Each of those stories cuts through the abstraction. They're not about innovation or disruption or pushing boundaries. They are about the oldest human facts: loss, grief, dependence. If it is your child in the Tesla, your father under the knife, your soldiers in the dark, you don't care how cool the launch montage looks on YouTube. You only care about two questions: who decided this was worth the risk, and where were you when they made that decision? The uncomfortable answer again and again is that nobody really decided, in the old, deliberate sense. We slid. We slid from cruise control to semi-autonomy because it made sense on paper and was exciting in adverts. We slid from landlines and fiber to satellite links because they were faster to deploy and cheaper to maintain. We slid from human moderators and journalists to algorithmic feeds controlled by whoever could afford to buy the platform. At no point did we hold a global referendum on whether we wanted to live in a world where one person's portfolio includes motors, orbits, news feeds, neural implants, and AI. We just kept buying, clicking, voting, investing, hoping someone would make the future less embarrassing. This is where his cult of personality stops being a meme and starts becoming a structural risk. Because the more we compress the story of 21st century progress into one face, one name, one set of mannerisms, the less imagination we have for any alternative. If he fails, we tell ourselves, maybe humanity just wasn't meant to go to Mars. Maybe electric cars were never going to work. Maybe space should be left to governments that can take the losses quietly. Maybe ambitious infrastructure projects are just doomed in democracies. Notice the trap? Tie your hope for whole categories of progress to a single celebrity industrialist, and he becomes too big to fail. Not because of the balance sheet, but because of what his failure would do to our courage. Investors sense this and behave accordingly. They tolerate volatility in his companies that would get lesser CEOs thrown to the wolves. They spin narratives to justify valuations that wobble on the edge of fantasy. They shrug at governance structures that concentrate power instead of diffusing it. Not because they're stupid, because they're afraid that if they walk away, they won't just miss out on returns. They'll signal that the era of big, daring bets is over, and none of them want to be the one blamed for closing that door. Meanwhile, ordinary people play their own small part in the worship-resentment cycle. We make jokes about his tweets, share memes mocking his haircuts, obsess over his dating life. We rage when he says something reckless, then snap up his products the moment they go on sale. There's a part of us that loves having someone to point at and say, "That's the problem. That guy." Because as long as the story is, Elon Musk is the problem, we get to avoid the far more frightening story. What if we are the ones who built a system where the only way to get certain kinds of progress is to tolerate men like him? What if the empire here isn't his, but ours? An empire of distractions and shortcuts and cowardice that needed a figure like this to carry what we abandoned. It would be nice, at this point, to pivot into a clean prescription. To say, here's how we fix it. Pass these laws, break up those companies, regulate this, nationalize that, boycott the other. Some of that might be necessary. None of it will be enough. Because the uncomfortable truth sitting at the edge of this story is that power is concentrating in the hands of people like him everywhere, not just in his industries, not just in his country. AI labs, data monopolies, cloud infrastructure, logistics, biotech, different faces, different brands. Same pattern. One brain plus one network plus one pile of capital equals a lever big enough to move pieces states use to move. If governments don't relearn how to use their own levers, they become clients. If citizens don't relearn how to demand slower, boring, accountable progress, they become fans. You can already see both trends. Presidents and prime ministers flying to court tech titans in back rooms, begging, threatening, flattering. Voters cheering when their favorite billionaire owns a politician on social media, as if that's a victory for them, not a reminder of their own shrinking role. Maybe you've done it. Maybe you've felt that little rush when someone you follow humiliates a person you distrust. It feels good to have a champion. Right up until the moment you realize that champions, too, keep ledgers. They're not fighting for you. They're fighting for a vision of the world that uses you. The only real question is whether, by the time you notice the difference, you still have any say left in how that world works. When you strip away the sci-fi aesthetics, the rockets, the Teslas, the orbital meshes, the implants, what's left at the core of this story is something brutally old. One person riding a wave of fear and hope, finding the pressure points of a civilization that lost faith in its own institutions and offering to shoulder those burdens for a price. The price is not written on a billboard. It doesn't show up in a line on your bank statement. It's in the slow shift of agency, from parliaments to boardrooms, from regulators to private compliance teams, from citizens to users, from "we decided" to "he announced." Maybe in a century, they'll talk about him the way we talk about industrial barons now, a flawed, dangerous, brilliant figure who built the scaffolding for something bigger than himself, then got swallowed by it. Or maybe they won't talk about him much at all. Maybe by then, there will be so many Musks in so many sectors that he'll blur into a familiar archetype, the first of a wave of private emperors who learned that in the 21st century, crowns are optional, as long as everyone quietly agrees to live inside your systems. You can't vote him out. You can't ignore him. You probably can't entirely boycott him. But you can decide how honestly you're willing to see the trade you've made with him and with every other figure like him who will follow. Because in the end, this isn't really a documentary about Elon Musk. It's an X-ray of how close modern life has drifted to a world where the most important question when something breaks isn't "what does the law say?" or "what do we as a people want?" It's "has he checked his phone yet?" Not that one man ended up with this much leverage, but that so many of us quietly accepted a world where that final question feels normal. Has he checked his phone yet? That is not how grown civilizations are supposed to work. And yet, here we are. You, me, all of us, living in a timeline where a rocket launch, a satellite switch, an update to a fleet of cars, a policy change on a platform, a joke typed half asleep, can ripple through markets, armies, families, lives. You didn't vote for that. You inherited it. You inherited a future where the most daring projects are often private, where the boldest gambles are made in boardrooms, where the biggest infrastructure plans come not from parliaments, but from pitch decks and press conferences. So let's be honest with each other before we part ways. You are not powerless, but you are not as powerful as you were told either. Your vote still matters. Your voice still matters. Your choices still matter. Just not in the clean, tidy way your civics teacher promised. Not in a world where companies have become kingdoms and their CEOs behave like characters out of a myth written in code and stock options. What you do with that gap between the story you were sold and the reality you live in, that's where your responsibility starts. You just spent time on something slower than a clip, harder than a meme, less flattering than a fan edit or a hit piece. You chose to sit with nuance, with discomfort, with a picture that refuses to let you love or hate without thinking. that already sets you apart from most of the feed. So here is my offer to you, laid out without tricks. If you want more of this kind of work, stories that don't beg for your uncritical worship, that don't pat you on the head and tell you it's all their fault, that don't reduce history to team jerseys, then tell the machine that this is what you reward. Not with blind loyalty, with one simple, concrete signal. Before you let the algorithm drag you into the next outrage, hit subscribe to Golden History USA. Not as a favor to me, as a message to the system itself. Send me more of this, the difficult stuff, the forensic stuff, the stories that make me less certain, not more. Turn on the notifications not because you need another dopamine hit, but because everything in this landscape is designed to bury complicated stories under cheap adrenaline. If you've made it this far, you know you don't need more cheap adrenaline. And in the comments, don't waste your time arguing over whether Elon Musk is good or evil, genius or fraud. That argument is a trap, and it keeps you exactly where you're easiest to use. Instead, write down one thing you're going to watch differently after this. Maybe it's how you feel when a billionaire owns a politician you dislike. Maybe it's the way you talk about innovation without asking who owns the wires underneath. Maybe it's whether you still laugh when someone says, "Relax, it's just a car, just an app, just a rocket." That's the real exchange between us. You gave me your time, your attention, your willingness to sit in a story that didn't let you off the hook. In return, I am giving you back a question that you don't get to unknow. The next time you see a headline about a launch, a new AI model, a neural implant, a platform policy change, ask yourself, really ask yourself, who just gained leverage over my life, and what did I quietly agree to so they could get it? If this film did its job, that question will follow you into the next video, the next election, the next big announcement from some stage with lights and music and promises of salvation. And if you want us to keep dragging these empires into the light, whether they belong to entrepreneurs, parties, churches, platforms, or states, then stay. Stay with this channel. Stay with this kind of work. Stay with the discomfort. Because the age of private empires isn't going away. The only real choice you have now is whether you move through it as a spectator or as someone who insists stubbornly on seeing the whole board, even when every piece on it is begging you to look only at them.